Interviewer, what about women like Mae West, an old-style sex queen who didn't apparently strike audiences the way you suggest? Sontag, I think she did. Whether or not she started with the oldest of blandishments, her glory was as a new-style sex queen. That is, the impersonator of one. Unlike Sarah Bernhardt's style, which audiences at a certain moment stopped being able to take straight, Mae West's was appreciated from the beginning as a sort of parody, letting oneself self-consciously be beguiled by such robust, shrill, vulgar parody is the last step in a century-long evolution and progressive democratization of the aestheticism whose broader history and implications are sketched in Notes on Camp, but which has had its most knowing reception from the milieu in which the word camp appeared some 50 years ago. Although scholars of slang disagree as much about the origin of camp as they do about okay, I assume that it derives from camper, which the Oxford French Dictionary translates as to posture boldly. I'm going to read all that again. It's just too good. Interviewer, what about women like Mae West, an old-style sex queen who didn't apparently strike audiences the way you suggest? Sontag. I think she did. Whether or not she started with the oldest of blandishments, her glory was as a new-style sex queen, that is, the impersonator of one. Unlike Sarah Bernhardt's style, which audiences at a certain moment stopped being able to take straight, Mae West's was appreciated from the beginning as a sort of parody, letting oneself self-consciously be beguiled by such robust, shrill, vulgar parody is the last step in a century-long evolution and progressive democratization of the aestheticism whose broader history and implications are sketched in Notes on Camp, but which has had its most knowing reception from the milieu in which the word camp appeared some 50 years ago, although scholars of slang disagree as much about the origin of camp as they do about okay. I assume that it derives from camper, which the Oxford French Dictionary translates as to posture boldly. And it was in the 1920s that a kind of deconstruction of the stereotypes of femininity gets underway, a mocking challenge to sexism that complements the moralistic call for justice and reparations to women that had found its voice in the 1890s in, say, Shaw's essays and George Gissing's novel The Odd Women. What I am arguing is that today's feminist consciousness has a long and complicated history of which the diffusion of male homosexual taste is a part, including its sometimes witless put-downs of and delirious homage to the feminine. Feminists have been less quick at seeing this than some of their opponents. For example, Wyndham Lewis, whose novel diatribe The Childermass, written in the late 20s, contains a long speech about how the naturally feminine and the masculine are being subverted jointly by homosexuals and by suffragettes. Contemporary homosexuality is denounced as, quote, a branch of the feminist revolution, end of quote. And Lewis was not wrong to link them. Interviewer, in The Pornographic Imagination, written in 1967, you describe the heroine of Story of O as a woman who progresses simultaneously toward her own extinction as a human being and her fulfillment as a sexual being. Let me reread that. In The Pornographic Imagination, written in 1967, you describe the heroine of Story of O as a woman who, quote, progresses simultaneously toward her own extinction as a human being and her fulfillment as a sexual being. Seems like that could have benefited from the use of a comma. Interviewer, in The Pornographic Imagination, written in 1967, you describe the heroine of Story of O as a woman who, quote, progresses simultaneously toward her own extinction as a human being, comma, and her fulfillment as a sexual being. End of quote. You then wonder, quote, how anyone would ascertain whether there exists truly, empirically, anything in, quote, nature, end of quote, or human consciousness that supports such a split, end of quote. It seems to me that the loss of self in exchange for sexual fulfillment might be viewed as an allegory of the new feminist awareness. That is, in exchange for fulfillment as women, women have often surrendered their identities as autonomous individuals. Do you agree there might be more to Story of O than you saw in 1967? Could that book be considered a peculiarly political work whose meaning could be enriched by a feminist perspective? Sontag, though I'd agree that one can extract useful lessons from all sorts of unpromising material, O's destiny seems to me an unlikely allegory of either feminist awareness or simply the age-old subjection of women. My interest in Story of O was, still would be, in its candor about the demonic side of sexual fantasy. The violence of the imagination that it consecrates and does not at all deplore cannot be confined within the optimistic and rationalist perceptions of mainstream feminism. Pornography's form of utopistic thinking is, like most of science fiction, a negative utopia. Since the writers who have insisted on how fierce, disruptive, and antinomian in energy sexuality, potentially ideally, since the writers who have insisted on how fierce, disruptive, and antinomian in energy sexuality, potentially ideally, are mostly men, it's commonly supposed that this form of the imagination must discriminate against women. I don't think it does necessarily. It could discriminate against men, as in Monique Wittig's celebrations of unfettered sexual energy. Man, a lot of name dropping in this one. What distinguishes the work of the pornographic imagination from other accounts of the erotic life is that it treats sexuality as an extreme situation. That means that what pornography depicts is, in one obvious sense, quite unrealistic. Sexual energy is not endlessly renewable. Sex acts cannot be tirelessly repeated. But in another sense, pornography is rudely accurate about important realities of desire. That voluptuousness does mean surrender, and that sexual surrender pursued imaginatively enough, experienced immoderately enough, does erode pride of individuality and mocks the notion that the will could ever be free. These are truths about sexuality itself and what it may naturally become, because it is such an ascesis to live completely for voluptuousness. Only a few women and men ever do pursue pleasure to this terminal extreme. The fantasy of sexual apocalypse is common enough, however, indisputably a means for intensifying sexual pleasure. And what that tells us about the inhuman, as it were, character of intense pleasure still being slighted by the humanist revisionist Freudianism that most feminists feel comfortable with, which minimizes the intractable powers of unconscious or irrational feeling. You propose a political view of the book in place of my tentative idea about something in nature or in human consciousness. But I would still reaffirm that speculation. There seems to be something inherently defective or self-frustrating in the way the sexual impulse works in human beings. For instance, an essential, that is normal, not accidental, that is neurotic, link between sexual energy and obsession. It appears likely that the full development of our sexual being does clash with the full development of our consciousness. Instead of supposing that all our sexual discontent is part of a tax sexuality pays for being civilized, it may be more correct to assume that we are, first of all, sick by nature, and that it is our being, to begin with, that what Nietzsche called sick animals, that makes us civilization-producing animals. It is the innate incongruence between important achievements in the realms of sexual fulfillment and of individual consciousness that is exacerbated by the enlarged use to which sexuality has been put in modern secular culture. As the credibility of religious experience has declined, erotic experience has not only gotten an inflated, even grandiose significance, but it is itself now subjected to standards of credibility, thereby attaching a whole new sort of anxiety to sexual performance. In particular, the quest for the experience of complete psychic surrender, now no longer enclosed within traditional religious forms, has become increasingly and restlessly attached to the mind-blowing character of the orgasm. The myths of total sexual fulfillment dramatized in Story of O concern that peculiarly modern via negativa. Evidence about the feelings and sexual tastes in our culture before it was wholly secularized. And in other cultures, past and present, suggests that voluptuousness was rarely pursued in this way as the organon to transcend individual consciousness. Perhaps only when sexuality is invested with that ideological burden, as it is now, does it also become a real and not just a potential danger to personhood and to individuation. Interviewer. In his book, Fellow Teachers, Philip Reif writes, true criticism is constituted, first, by repeating what is already known. The great teacher is he who, because he carries in himself what is already known, can transfer it to his student. That inwardness is his absolute and irreducible authority. If a student fails to recognize that authority, then he is not a student. End of quote. Obviously, the authoritative knowing Reif invokes has nothing to do with the expertise of the specialist. What do you take him to mean by, and would you agree that according to Reif's definition, there are very few students in our institutions of higher learning? Sontag, precious few students according to that definition, yes, but perhaps still more than enough, since again, following Philip Reif's definition, there are probably no professors. The authority of the professoriate being invoked here goes no further back than Wilhelmine Germany. That there are very few students in the prescriptive sense, devoted, talented lovers of learning, is surely as well known as that there are many more students in the descriptive sense, bodies in classrooms. Liberal arts education having assumed those functions which precisely make it harder than it was a generation ago to assign so-called difficult books and to expound complex ideas without backtalk from the students. But Philip Reif does not make his case against mass education more convincing by overstating it. When in Western intellectual history did the college teacher have, quote, an absolute and irreducible authority, end of quote? Even in the great ages of faith, which one might suppose well stocked with models for the pedagogue as dictator, a closer look discloses a reassuring ferment of dissent, of heterodoxy, of questioning what was, quote, already known, end of quote. Fiat cannot restore to the office of the teacher, now irrevocably secular, transmitting a plurality of traditions, an absolute authority that both the teacher and what is being taught do not have, if they ever did. Let me repeat that sentence. Fiat cannot restore to the office of the teacher, now irrevocably secular, transmitting a plurality of traditions, an absolute authority that both the teacher and what is being taught do not have, if they ever did. The genuine historical pressures to lower the standards for higher learning that do exist aren't weakened by declaring what words ought to mean, defining a teacher as one who teaches authoritatively, a student as one who accepts the authority of the teacher. Perhaps one should take Philip Reif's definitions as evidence that the fight to maintain the highest standards really is a lost cause. If the decline of first-rate teaching in universities really is irreversible, as it probably is, then one should expect exactly such a defense of the ancien regime as is projected by these empty definitions of great teacher and great student. Making a virtue of its own historical inappropriateness, Philip Reif's authoritarian theory of the university parallels the authoritarian theory of the bourgeois state advanced in Germany and France in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Whereas traditionally a teacher had authority by virtue of a particular doctrine, a, quote, teaching, end of quote, what is proposed here is a very modern, contentless notion of authority. Contentless notion of authority. Not the authority of, say, the Nicene Creed, but the authority of authority. The substance of the teacher's authority having been eroded, only its form remains. Authority itself, quote, that inwardness, end of quote, is made the defining characteristic of the great teacher. Perhaps one only stakes out such a large, truculent claim to authority when one can't possibly have it. Even in the Maoist conception of the relation between leaders and masses, the authority of the great teacher does not derive tautologically from his authority, but from his wisdom. A much advertised part of which consists in overturning what is already known. But Philip Reif's notion of the teacher has more in common with the Maoist pedagogic conception than with the main tradition of Western activity and high culture that he thinks he's defending against barbarous students. It is formulated in a fashion as dismissive of independence of thought as Maoism. To define a teacher primarily in terms of the idea of authority seems to me grossly inadequate to the standards of that elite education for which Philip Reif is proselytizing. That the definition encourages wishful thinking and licenses personal arrogance is relatively unimportant. Let me repeat that sentence. That the definition encourages wishful thinking and licenses personal arrogance is relatively unimportant. What is important is that it leaves out virtually all the teacherly virtues. Wisdom, as I've already mentioned, and the Socratic pedagogic eros. Forget about humility if that is too radical or it sounds mawkish. But what about skepticism? A little skepticism about what one carries in oneself, if one is well educated, might be especially useful to balance the temptations of self-righteousness. As someone who, like Philip Reif, had the good fortune to do undergraduate work in the most ambitious and the most successful authoritarian program of education ever devised in this country, the Hutchins-era College of the University of Chicago. What a name dropper. It remains as much as he, I would think, a partisan of the non-elective curriculum. Let me repeat that sentence. As someone who, like Philip Reif, had the good fortune to do undergraduate work in the most ambitious and the most successful authoritarian program of education ever devised in this country, the Hutchins-era College of the University of Chicago, I remain as much as he, I would think, a partisan of the non-elective curriculum. But I'm aware that all such forms of consensus about, quote, great, end of quote, books and, quote, perennial, end of quote, problems, once stabilized, tend to deteriorate eventually into something Philistine. The real life of the mind is always at the frontiers of, quote, what is already known, end of quote. Those great books don't only need custodians and transmitters. To stay alive, they also need adversaries. To stay alive, they also need adversaries. The most interesting ideas are heresies.